The title of today's talk is one that you gave me, actually, which is sometimes which initially a speaker resents and then comes to love because it makes us think about something different and how to pitch our ideas and our insights differently. And the title is Professional Capital and the Fight for Our Lives. And when we talk about the fight for our lives, what do we mean? We're talking, of course, about the fight for our lives as a teaching profession, as an education profession. But primarily, we're talking about the fight for the lives of children, the fight for the life. This is the hour and the hour and the hour for our children, for their parents, for their families, wherever they are, everywhere they are. It's a fight for those who teach them, who make them safe, who protect them, who care for them in this turbulent world that we are in. It's a fight understanding that if our teachers don't have well-being, our students won't have well-being. If our teachers aren't safe and secure, our students won't be safe and secure. It's a fight in the face of another fight, which is an attack on teachers, an attack on the poor, the marginalized, and all those who teach them. It's an attack on the majority of teachers who are women. It's an attack on women, joining the attack on women in politics, women in leadership, women and their own bodies, women and their own lives. The attack on teaching and the attack on teachers, let's make no mistake about it, is an attack on women and women who organize. And that's a disgrace, and that's how we should start to pitch it and to name it in public, because more people will join with us when we do. This is the fight of our lives, and I want to address it in three ways. If I lose my words at any point this morning, it's because my brain is somewhere between Texas and Rotterdam right now, having come in on a flight yesterday. I've been studying teaching, being a teacher, being with teachers. I realized to my horror 2 nights ago, for 40 years, my first articles were published in 1977, 1976. And although I can't see you because I'm in the light and you're in the dark, hopefully not metaphorically, only physically, I began studying teaching as a sociologist, having read the D-Schoolers, having read Everett Reimer, Neil Postman, the progressive educators, Paulo Freire and his argument against banking education. I grew up understanding that actually teachers were the problem. Teachers perpetuated inequity, that classrooms consisted 2/3 of the time by talk, and 2/3 of that talk was the teacher's talk. That teachers asked closed questions rather than open questions. That teachers weren't sensitive to the differences in their classes. That this happened in traditional classrooms, and it also happened in progressive classrooms where the white middle-class kids could understand the codes of the apparent questions and invitations the teacher was asking, and the working-class kids and the black working-class kids could not, in ways that people like Lisa Delpit have written about very well. I began by remembering my best teachers and also wanting to be better than my worst teachers. And when I started teaching, most of the teachers I saw remind me of the worst teachers I had rather than the best teachers I had. Let's put away the romanticism of all teachers everywhere for all time and understand that in many places teachers have been perpetuators of inequity. There were 4 writers in Britain, Rachel Sharp, Tony Green, Jeff Whitty, Michael Young, at the time, who wrote about these things, and then there was a bit of a backlash about their writing, and it said, you know, not everything in education is Young and Whitty, Sharp and Green. So this is where we began, and it's where I began, by looking at classroom interaction, and then fortuitously I began to look not at what teachers didn't do and why, but to try and understand what they did do. That if teachers didn't always do the right thing or the best thing or the most difficult thing, it wasn't because they were bad people or had been misselected, that there was something about their work lives and their environment, about the way it was structured, about the way they were controlled, about the time they had or didn't have, about how isolated they were or were not, about what their histories were, their biographies, about how well they were paid, about how secure they felt. That all these things affected what teachers did. And so my work began to move to looking not at what teachers didn't do, but what teachers did do, even if I didn't like it. And trying to understand first, as you do with a child, even children you don't like, you begin by asking, what is it they have? And why is it that they do what they do, rather than being disapproving and sanctimonious about the things that displease you? And then understanding what teachers do, we have increasingly over time, as teaching's got better, and it really has, as teaching's got better, as it's become more culturally responsive, more differentiated, more inclusive of children with special educational needs, more able to hand diverse classrooms, unexpected children with overwhelming problems who come into our schools and out of our schools to someone else's school almost every day. As teaching has got better, understanding teaching and the nature of teaching and the challenge of teaching has become even more important still. One of the fights of our lives is a fight to understand teachers and teaching so that they can be the best they can be everywhere for all their students. To understand that is now the second thing, which is to understand some of the changing things in the world that are making teaching more sophisticated, more difficult, more in need even further of being a profession with discretionary judgment, not standardized algorithmic practices to respond to the rapidly changing populations that teachers in all countries everywhere almost are finding in front of them. And as we understand this changing world, then we'll come to, thirdly, the issue of what professional capital, this strange phase, means, why we need it, why it may help us find a narrative that will speak not only to our base. Our base is the easy part. The laboring, the industrial part is the easy part of what we do. The Democrats failed the last election because they spoke only to their base, and they did not speak to people who disagreed with them or differed from them. They particularly failed to address in any iota of a way whatsoever those who were poor, white, working class. And if the poor, white, working class have no identity, or an identity that only invokes guilt and privilege and is negative, then they fall prey to what the sociologist Irving Goffman, in his magnificent book Stigma, a study of people with disabilities, shows that if you have no identity or a negative identity, the first thing you do is you separate yourselves from those who stigmatize you. You close yourself in. You form a subgroup. And then you develop everything that disvalues you. You take as a point of pride. Cripple becomes a point of pride. Black becomes a point of pride. Gay becomes a point of pride. White trash becomes a point of pride, because we live in a world not only of intersecting identities, but interacting identities. And if we feel insecure and disvalued in our own identity, then we will inflict damage on other people's identities beyond us. The world is changing dramatically, and here's just some of the ways in which it is. So, apparently if I move across here, I'll be able to see my slides. So, let's see. It could be a miracle. The hardest thing about being here is there's a number 10 on the screen, and it's in green, and when it begins to work, it goes down to 9876. But like post-traumatic stress, you never know the moment when this number 10 will start to move down to lower numerals. Not everything has been bad globally in the last few years. The Guardian newspaper in England recently reported that when we have concerted effort, the things we can achieve together on a global scale are remarkable. We've done a lot about what we might call absolute poverty, people in complete dire need caused by hunger and starvation. We've lifted 471 million people out of extreme poverty, and the Sustainable Development Goals and all that energized have brought about some real achievements. But we also know from the work of Thomas Piketty, an obscure French economist who became a worldwide bestseller, that the biggest thing is not necessarily just levels of low income versus high income, but the relationship between low income and high income in most countries. Piketty shows worldwide that 48% of global wealth is owned by 1% of the population. 48% owned by 1% of the population. And if we look at a series of books in America and elsewhere, we know what that means. This is Bob Putnam in his book, Our Kids, or J.D. Vance in his book, Hillbilly Elegy. And there are many more of these books that talk about qualitatively what that feels like when we live near to, close to people who are profoundly in a different place than we are. In 1967, a sociologist called William Runciman wrote a book in England called Relative Deprivation and Social Justice, which indicated that we feel most injustice not to those who are far away from us, but to those who are very close to us. Those who are far away cause the injustice, but we perceive it in relation to the people very close to us. So we don't resent the wealth of Donald Trump, or the wealth of J.P. Morgan, or the wealth of Goldman Sachs. We resent the person who has a secure job and a pension compared to ourselves who don't. We reject, as Arlie Hochschild calls in a brilliant new book about Louisiana, we reject the people who seem to be cutting in line ahead of us, the people who arrive in the country and get a job before we do, the people of a different color or ethnicity who seem to have privileges, advantages, and opportunities and categories when we don't, the people who scrounge on welfare when we seem to be hardworking and decent. It's the people, it's what Freud called the tyranny of minor difference that people focus on, even though it's the big differences that cause the inequities. And Runciman's son, a professor at Oxford University, notes now that some of the greatest inequities increasingly are white-on-white violence in North America, as well as white-on-black and black-on-black. All these inequities matter. All those walk into our schools. And the biggest way they have an effect is what in 1973 Richard Sennett, based on a study of working-class adults in Boston who had failed their public schooling, called the hidden injuries of class. And what he found amongst these adults who'd been years out of school was that failing school caused them to lose many things, but the biggest thing of all that they lost was their dignity, their sense of worth, their sense of value. You can take away people's dignity, but you cannot give it to them. But it's so easy. It's like trust. It is so easy to take away. And if you've watched recently a movie, which I haven't shown you because most English people can't understand the British accents that are in this movie. They are from an obscure part of northeastern England. But Daniel Blake, the Palme d'Or winner last year at the Cannes Film Festival, produced by 80-year-old Ken Loach, is about a 60-something man, a carpenter, who has a heart attack and loses his job and is subjected to the labyrinthine bureaucracy of welfare payments, which are designed to make him give up in seeking welfare payments. And this speaks to me a lot because when I was 12, my dad died. My mum became very sick and we were on welfare. And I remember going down to those offices just the same way that you see with Daniel Blake, looking at an invisible, uncaring, unresponsive bureaucracy. And at the end of the movie, this is a bit of a spoiler. So if you don't want to hear the spoiler, you can cover up your ears now. At the end of this very compelling movie, he walks into a washroom and collapses. And at his funeral, a person he's befriended, a young woman and her family who were equally struggling, reads out at his funeral his last words that he'd written for his interview, appealing for his benefits to be considered after all the indignities that he had experienced. And this is what his note said. I, Daniel Blake, am not a client, a customer, nor a service user. I'm not a shirker, a scrounger, a beggar, nor a thief. I'm not a national insurance number or a blip on a screen. I paid my dues, never a penny short. I'm proud to do so. I don't tug the forelock, but I look my neighbor in the eye and help him if I can. I don't accept or seek charity. My name is Daniel Blake. I am a man, not a dog. As such, I demand my rights. I demand you treat me with respect. I, Daniel Blake, am a citizen. Nothing more, nothing less. It's a magnificent movie, and it addresses issues that connect economic inequities, not just issues of poverty and injustice, but issues that cut deep into ourselves and our sense, as you heard in the opening addresses, of what it means to be human, to have dignity. And these things have come back on our radar recently with the OECD's work. We'll have a discussion on this later on that is now looking not just at academic achievement, but also at well-being. And if you look at the OECD's work here, the most interesting chart perhaps out of well-being is this, that looks at the relationship between well-being and student achievement. So, if you want high achievement and high well-being, come here. Get a bicycle, come here, and you'll have high achievement and high well-being. If you want high well-being and low achievement, go south. Go to the Mediterranean. Your achievement won't be great, but the wine is fabulous, and the climate is glorious, and you'll be amongst Italians and Spaniards and bon vivants. That is if you have low achievement and high well-being. The most disturbing category, apart from the obvious one of the bottom left, is the one on the bottom right, which is high achievement and low well-being or quality of life. If you look at those countries, what do you notice about them? Most of them are in Southeast Asia. They're Southeast Asia and then an honorary member of the club, which is the disunited kingdom. Okay? So is high achievement causing low well-being? Is it leaving no space for low well-being? Do Asian cultures value well-being in a different way than we do? Not as by we, I mean Americans or British or Europeans. Do they see it perhaps as meaning, purpose, and sacrifice, not happiness and joy? Is it measured differently? We don't know, but we should think about these issues, and we should think about them harder. But we do know that when there is high income inequality, it also causes lots of negativity on all range of social indicators. And everything I've showed you here that varies between countries, according to this work by Wilkinson and Pickett, is the same variation across US states. That the ones with lowest income inequality are best in terms of things like not having great problems of obesity or alcoholism or drugs or teenage pregnancy or high imprisonment or whatever it is. So inequity matters, not just because it matters, but because it affects and it runs through everything else. And all the children of these inequities appear in your classrooms and the classrooms of your members. And then they're compounded by probably the greatest refugee crisis for 50 years, when people show up in your classrooms not with just missing a language or a few years of schooling, but multiple experiences of post-traumatic stress. The father being shot before their eyes, the home being destroyed, uprooted from their country, one after another, and you and your members are responsible for raising their PISA results when they come into your classrooms. And it's more than just working hard and giving more effort, but it's actually being better professionals who can deal with the diversity of who are in front of you. And then there's the global epidemic of mental health. This is just one example from a study in England of who might be showing up in an average class of 15-year-olds, self-harming, being bullied, being marginalized. And then we'll hear more about this at this conference. There's the world of computers and computing. The OECD shows that the countries that adopt computing most quickly show the least progress in student achievement. The ones that adopt most quickly show the least progress in student achievement. And a few years ago, when Dennis Shirley and I in our projects went into classrooms and asked teachers, what's going on with technology in your classrooms, what they'd say would be, all kids are connecting with other kids in other schools. We're accessing experts. We can download things through Google. We can have videos as well as textbooks. We can do all that. Now what teachers say to us is they talk about digital distraction, excessive screen time, disinhibition, bullying, uncontrolled, unconstrained language, especially of girls. Girls are achieving more and becoming more anxious all at the same time. And our failure to deal with digital technology as a problem as well as an opportunity as part of our skill set is part of this. And then you can add to all that in Singapore or in Hong Kong, where I saw a lesson on this last month in Liberal Studied. There's the spoiled child syndrome. There's a child who will show up in what the Singaporeans call the strawberry generation. Often spoiled, easily bruised. Often spoiled is the parents who watch over them all the time. The parents who micromanage, organize every single thing they do. The parents who show up at Boston College and want to question their children's grades that their professors have given them. The parents who make their children wear helmets for everything. Helmets on a scooter half an inch above the ground. Probably next helmets while they're having their cornflakes at breakfast. We'll soon be living our whole lives with helmets on, just in case anything might happen to us. There's a spoiled child syndrome. All these showing up in our classrooms. These are the questions we're asking now. Not just how are we doing and our achievement results going up and can we narrow the gaps, but who are we? What will become of us? Who will decide? Nice, Stockholm, Westminster. The 5 people murdered in a mosque in Quebec City, in Canada. Who is responsible? Well, what Confucius said is when you see a worthy person, endeavor to emulate him. When you see an unworthy person, examine your inner self. When something goes wrong in an indigenous communities, many of them sit round and ask the question, how are we responsible for this? It's a very hard question. How are we responsible? Did we teach these children well? Globally, did we give girls more access to education? And at the same time, how did we think about how we were educating our boys? Because it's not the girls who show up on the flatback trucks. It's not the girls with the Kalashnikovs. It's not the girls prompting violence. It's the men. We're talking about access of women to education worldwide. But what happens to women will be determined by the quality and character that we provide also for men and our young boys worldwide as well. And that is part of what it means to be a professional. And the 10's not moving yet, and I'm a bit relieved to see that. Countries are doing something about this. We're working with Ontario, and like many countries, they're thinking about excellence broadly defined, not just literacy and numeracy. They're thinking about well-being as a major priority. Even Singapore, where I was in March, Singapore is talking about less grading and more focusing on character, on outdoor education and adventure, on engaging with nature like the Norwegians as a routine part of what children do within their experience. Many countries are thinking about this, and others have an empty narrative, a vacuum. The United States has an empty narrative a vacuum at federal level, which is about choice and about defunding. That's about it. England, not the United Kingdom, because the countries of the United Kingdom vary a lot in their policies. England is now also a policy vacuum. No character, no focus, no sense of what England's citizens, students, young people will and should become. Just markets, academies, grammar schools, choice, fracturing, segregation, more of those inequalities that separate each of us from all the others around us, more intersecting identities, less interacting identities, because people don't see each other. So what does this mean? For this strange book you also asked me to talk about, called Professional Capital, a book that Michael Fullan and I wrote in 2012. The labor movement sometimes is a little skeptical about a book with the word capital in it. But capital is a metaphor. It's just a metaphor. If you want a return, make an investment. That applies to money, but it applies to many other things. The environmentalists have a term, natural capital, in terms of how we are stewards for and look after the environment around us. There's even a book on erotic capital. I also do speeches on this. They have much bigger audiences, and they are far less effective, okay? So it's a metaphor. If you want an investment, you get a return. And what we're increasingly finding with people like Eric Hines, who's president of the California Teachers Association, or Rebecca Holcomb, Secretary of Education for Vermont, who are adopting this in their language, it's enabling them to speak to people who are different from them as well as stoke up their base. Because people understand, many people, the basic metaphor of capital, even though they may disagree with the version of it. And in Professional Capital, we compared two kinds of capital. The one that is driving policy in many parts of the world now, which is a business capital model, showing all these things up here, which I hope you'll show in a second. They are up here. And that is, the business capital model is how we invest in education to get a short-term profit for the investors and to reduce the tax burden on the general population, so that public resources can be moved towards private ends. More charter schools, more academies, more technology, lower teacher salaries, less costs, more flexibility. This is the driving force of business capital. This is our enemy. This is our enemy, worldwide, everywhere. And when I say our, I mean the enemy of teachers. I mean the enemy of children, the enemy of the poor, the enemy of the marginalized. This is the enemy. And against it, what do we have? A model of professional capital, which characterizes the teaching currently in the highest performing countries, where teaching is hard, not easy, where we do it together, not alone, where it has high status, regard, and recognition, where it's not data-driven but evidence-informed, combined with our best judgment that we operate together as a community, where we're not replaced by technology, but work with technology and many other things as well. This is the professional capital model, and there are three components: human, decisional or judgment making, and social. Each of these components is itself under attack from the business capital model. So first, let me show you. This is what generically human capital looks like. And in the strongest countries, you'll get the best versions of this. So good human capital means you prepare teachers well, you educate them well. They come through universities like doctors, architects, engineers. They do a strong program. It's connected to good practice and to internships, and also to understanding cognitive science and engaging in reflection and inquiry into your practice. It's based on accumulating knowledge. It's based on emotional skill and capacity to empathize with young people. This is what it means generically. But there are attacks on human capital, and they are of two kinds. And if Dennis Shirley's getting distracted, he'd better wake up in a moment, because he has a shock coming from his best friend. And there are two attacks on the human capital view. The first is obvious. The first is that in a report by the GEMS Foundation, for example, a couple of years ago, they looked at global indicators of teacher status and then compared country by country and tried to argue that the same quality of outcomes were achieved in different countries at different costs. And that if actually, if Switzerland lowered its costs and increased its class sizes and paid teachers less, it could perform as well as Finland. Are you following me? In Canada, another report compared 4 provinces with the same results and argued that the other 3 provinces' salaries should fall to the level of British Columbia's salaries if everyone could deliver the outcomes at the same price. Not recognizing that that might cause a slight teacher recruitment problem in the other 3 provinces. But this is the efficiency argument. Not let's make it better, but let's do what we have at a lower price and cut back on simple metrics wherever we can. The other part of the attack on human capital is positive psychology. Optimism, resilience, grit, mindfulness. Karl Marx said religion was the opium of the people. Perhaps mindfulness is the new opium of the people. We may not be able to control our conditions or our destiny, but we can control our positive state of mind and our mindfulness. Companies are signing up positive psychologists with huge grants, not to pay their workforce more, but just so the workforce will feel more positive. Oliver Burkeman, an Englishman, had to be an Englishman because in England, misery loves company. Oliver Burkeman wrote a critique of this very American concept of positive psychology. And he went to ashrams and Buddhist hangouts and places where he had vows of silence and wrote about them. And he said basically a lot of this is a gentle form of capitalist oppression. When you have colleagues, as I do, who buy a treadmill so that at their desk they can get exercise, standing up, so they never have to go outside. It just means you work more. The treadmill was an instrument of medieval torture. It now means instead of going outside for a walk in nature, you can walk endlessly at your desk while you are working. An energy bar, which was meant for cyclists in the outside, is now used as an alternative for lunch. So we no longer need green vegetables or tomatoes or company or people, but we can sit tethered to our desk endlessly, producing profits for the corporations who employ us. And so too sometimes is it the case of mindfulness. We have one district in Ontario, for example, who understand that the teachers are stressed because every child they deal with in this district is seen as absolutely heartbreaking. In one of the districts, 600 teachers registered with district support for an online course in mindfulness. Now, if a dozen teachers register for an online course in mindfulness, you think it's probably a need for them and a joy for them and an opportunity in the system. If 600 teachers register for a course in mindfulness, you have to ask, what on earth is wrong with this system? And as one of the teachers said, we recognize that our staff are stressed. Sorry, that's the same quote as before. There's a false belief that yoga and meditation are sufficient to help teachers eliminate stress and get back to work. Now that you've yogaed and meditated, you should be good to go. The answer to systemic problems that cause ill-being is not individual responses that create well-being, or only individual responses that create well-being. The second is decisional capital. This is how we make judgments over time. A big issue for the profession now is what is professional judgment? What is professional judgment other than blind trust, which is we know you're qualified, we know you're prepared to do your job, and we're parents, and we say, leave it up to you, up to your judgment. Well, the attack on decisional capital looks like this: your judgment, your experience, how much practice you've got, how well you're mentored, coached, how you get challenged and stretched into things like inclusion or differentiated instruction or responding to culturally responsive pedagogy. This is what we mean by decisional capital or making good judgments. The attack on decisional capital comes from these areas. More data. You don't have the answer, the data do. When you have a problem, when in doubt, get more data. Cull more spreadsheets. Sit down with the figures. Look for the gaps. Make the interventions. Data's not a bad thing. Evidence isn't a bad thing. This association uses a lot of data and evidence. But data shouldn't drive us. We should not be the driven. We should be the drivers. That's the fundamental difference. Second is more testing. More testing means that the testing replaces the judgment. We have evidence, even in Ontario, which is mid-stakes testing, not high-stakes testing. So it's just so there's no punitive consequences, but everybody can see what everyone else is doing. We have evidence in Ontario of what is called the EQAO examination, which has been there for over 10 years now. We've evidence looking at schools in 1/7 of the school districts of testing causing ill-being, actively creating ill-being. Of children who are animated in some classes, once they sit on the test prep in the writing, start doodling in the margins, don't know how to respond, completely lose interest. Of items in northern Indigenous communities about riding on the subway in Toronto. Of students who have no great control over cursive writing, and in other classes are able to write on computer and display brilliantly what it is that they do, but not allowed to use those skills when they take the test together. Of teachers whose own children are afraid of letting their parents down when they are in their own schools. Over and over again, our evidence is that even mid-stakes standardized testing, when we're creating well-being, we also have to actively dispose of those things that create ill-being. And then third is the third and fourth, down to 9 minutes 15, but I think we're going to make it. The third and fourth are, third attack on decisional capital is the model of the economists, which is one of saying, let's get rid of most teachers after about every 4 years and turn them over quickly. Because the evidence is of American economists like Tom Kane, who've been hugely influential, and his peers like Eric Hanachek, is that teachers don't get any better after 4 years. They improve a lot over the first 4, and then they don't get much better at all. And if that's the case, well, why keep them? They're not getting any better. Why not just let them go? Well, it seems that these economists didn't take the basic stats class. And the basic stats class is if you start people off with almost no preparation, no proper university-based preparation, then your chances of that their baseline is low, so your chances of early improvement are great over the first 2 or 3 years. Then if you don't support them after that, statistically, they've just got less chance of improving. And actually, they've got less chance of improving because you're not supporting them anymore. So the 4-year argument doesn't come from a norm of how teachers are or always will be. It comes from a very particular policy environment within the United States that's falsely generalized to all other countries around the world. Put them in, work them hard, turn them over quickly, let them go, make some cheap business capital profit. Don't pay these women more longer as they stay in and get more secure. Take the women, work them hard, let them go, move them on. That's the third attack on decisional capital. And the last one, which is related, comes from documents like this, very influential document called The Mirage. a study produced by the New Teacher Project, which has an interest in America as a semi-corporate funded foundation of doing a business of developing teachers in their early years of teaching. So it has a high interest in high teacher turnover. And what it did was a study of 3 school districts with over 1,000 teachers, which basically showed, picked out the top quartile and how they improved over 2 years, and the bottom quartile that didn't improve over 2 years. And they concluded there were no differences between the top and bottom quartile in the professional development that they experienced, which was job embedded, not job embedded, workshop, not workshop, collaborative, not collaborative. This is a very influential document. The result, they said, is an average of $18,000 per year per teacher of professional development expenditure is totally wasted. This study is also deeply flawed methodologically and leads to the conclusion that has no evidence that instead of developing our teachers, what we should be doing is evaluating them competitively against each other and getting rid of the worst and rewarding the few who are the best over time. These are the enemies of decisional capital. And last but not least is social capital. The evidence we set out in professional capital is whatever your human capital that you bring into teaching, however you are, whatever your skills, whatever your knowledge, if you work together and work together well, you will become better than if you work by yourself. There are many ways of working together, not all of them equally effective, but on average you will become better. This is social capital. What does it look like? Building trust, developing collaboration, having collective responsibility for all student success in your class as well as my class, in your school as well as my school, in your district as well as in my district. Helping each other and creating networks to move the knowledge around. There's many ways to do this. We're studying them at the moment in a project across 8 different countries, looking at the different ways that people collaborate in different cultures. This is what social capital looks like. What's the enemy of social capital? The enemy of social capital is, for example, this paper produced by the London Centre for Market-Based Reforms, which talks about collaborative overreach. It argues incorrectly that most collaboration is ineffective, has no impact on student achievement, is a professional self-indulgence and distraction. Unfortunately, the evidence base it uses is mainly of districts working with districts, and it's based in England. And the evidence actually from districts working with districts is some is effective, some is not. But because some are ineffective, it writes all of them off as being ineffective. So there's a third argument, just watch for it, because it's becoming very popular even with Andreas Schleicher, that collaboration is the new answer for educational change. There's an argument against collaboration because it's expensive, it takes time, it requires investment, and it gives you control. And there are some people who don't really like that, especially when you're women. Some of the men who run the systems don't like the women being in control. I really urge you to make this more of a gender issue than it currently is, because I think a lot of the world will be behind you if you do. Last. Just to think about. So as we think about how to collaborate better, understanding that not all collaboration is equally effective, I just want to leave you with thinking about this, which is, in reclaiming the profession, we need to reclaim both the collective and the individual aspects of it, both. We need to have collective responsibility for all student success, but also reclaim personal responsibility. The right loves personal responsibility. The left loves collective responsibility. Rejoice in the fact that they both love responsibility and find ways to bring them together. So Sebastian, could you put up the slide, please, from the that I asked you to put up before? And you can't probably quite see this, and indeed neither can I. So I will just read a couple of these to you so that they'll give a sense of what's there. So collective autonomy, which sounds paradoxical, means teachers have more autonomy from the bureaucracy, but less autonomy from each other. More autonomy from the bureaucracy, less autonomy from each other. What does that mean? It means that you're transparent to each other, that you share what you have, that you see what I just saw in Hong Kong, which is an open class where 4 teachers learn how to teach the same class together. And one of them teaches it to a lot of visitors and asks for critical feedback. And so that when the critical feedback comes, it's not of the teacher, it's of the class for which they have collective responsibility. Collective responsibility means us and our students, us and our schools. The special ed and the regular teacher taking collective responsibility for the same child. But don't forget personal responsibility. What is personal responsibility? What the best teachers have always done. Work hard. Give up other things sometimes. Do the best you can. Take the first step in helping a colleague or making a change. Apologize for mistakes. Speak out against the injustices of a poor policy, an uncaring colleague, or a climate of racial violence. Support a student or colleague who is being bullied. Challenge poor leadership. Initiate your own learning. These things are personal responsibility as well as collective. So in doing all the collective things, we also have to reclaim, in a way, the personal and the individual too, and hold them side by side. What does that mean at the end? It means in the 5 minutes that we have, not all of which I will use, it means these things. If we can put the PowerPoints back on, could we? It means, what does this look like? When you've got good collaboration and good professional judgment, working together with highly qualified teachers who think a lot about diversity, means that when you're working in an indigenous community with children with fetal alcohol syndrome, at first you put in a kitchen so that they can do practical things and use their energy as well as sit down, concentrate learning. And then when the kids start to climb the walls, start to climb the kitchen cabinets physically, how do you respond then? Well, how this school responded is, it had a professional learning community run by the teachers, not by the principal. It used to be run by the principal, but the teachers said, we're seeing these kids do great things on the ice hockey rink and showing great leadership, but they're not doing it in the classroom. Can we sit down, the physical education teachers with regular teachers, and think what the transferable skills might be from the areas where they're being successful to the areas where they're being less successful? One outcome of that was this: a climbing wall in the classroom. A climbing wall, not outside the classroom. Anytime the kid needs to climb, they go climb. They climb for 3 or 4 minutes. When they need to climb, they get it out the system and they get a bit of exercise. And then they go sit down and they do a bit more learning. I saw yesterday that there's a policy in Norway, I think, that kids exercise every 45 minutes. Every 45 minutes, there's a bit of exercise. This is what good judgment in a diverse community of teachers working together who are well qualified to begin with actually looks like. This is a profession that benefits all students. This is the fight of our lives. It's the fight of our lives for ourselves, to be well qualified, to make good judgments, to base that on evidence, to learn about our more diverse populations, to respond to the students who are different, to take personal responsibility for that, to do that collectively, not just individually, and then after all that, to argue and advocate for the industrial conditions that mean teachers' working conditions or students' learning conditions. that student well-being needs teacher well-being, and that justice for students demands justice for our teachers as well. Thank you for listening. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conference.